Finally, we arrive at industrial food production, which is the food system in which we all participate today. So industrial food production can be thought of as starting during the first cities, really. This picture on the left is of Mexico City, a beautiful place called Xochimilco. Maybe you've been there. And in Mexico City, the Aztecs began planting floating gardens that were anchored into the bottom of lakes by fast-growing trees like willow trees, and then creating sort of mud-based floating gardens that would support the food production that they needed in order to feed a population of about 250,000 people in Mexico City before the Spanish came in the 1500s. So when the Spanish came, they drained all the lakes in order to make it easier to conquer this population, except for one. They did not drain Xochimilco, or at least people were able to create it to make it into a lake again. And these floating gardens are still there. The industrial food production that we're most familiar with is sort of the modern industrial food production. This allows us as consumers to go to a local grocery store, for instance, or a local restaurant, or fast food place in order to get the food that we want to survive. Being able to go to the grocery store allows us to have different lives than the farmers, right? Allows us to have specialization in terms of the kinds of careers that we have and the lives that we lead. So industrial food production is the only kind of food production in all of human history that is, for some of us, completely divorced from our lives, right? So for instance, I in general don't know how my food is produced. I don't know where it's being done, who is doing it, what do the fields look like, how are the animals raised and kept and slaughtered. And it is the most digital type of food production that's ever existed, because now we have all kinds of technology that can allow the managers of these large farms to access things like soil composition and changing weather patterns. And it also, in the United States at least, relies upon an enormous workforce of people who are here in the United States, either legally or not legally. They are undocumented, but without whom our food production would essentially stop. So we rely on a lot of invisible people in order to have access to the food that we need and want. So the goal of industrial food production is basically to produce food at the lowest cost possible. Again, this has to do with our global capitalist economy and how the owners and managers of these farms, who aren't really the farmers anymore, but they run the farms as businesses, mechanized and digitized businesses. Their goal is to make profit. Sometimes they don't eat any of the food that they produce. Sometimes it's not even produced as food. It's produced as, let's say, corn sent to a company that then takes that corn and extracts all of the different elements so it can be added to many different types of foods, right? In corn syrup and, glucose and all of the other things that you can make out of corn molecules. So the mechanization of industrial food really relies on the processes that take place in the factories. They use vehicles, they use electronic and digital technology that's very advanced, completely reliant on information from the internet. So this is really internet age food. in which the digital technology taps into all of the information from, say, the NOAA Weather Service, or other types of information, stock prices, things like that, that allow the farmers, the managers of these farms, to make decisions. It's highly reliant on chemicals, so chemical fertilizers, chemical pesticides, chemical insecticides, herbicides, all the different sides. And these chemicals are basically feeding the soil, because in most of these places, the soil is completely dead and depleted. So they need to add chemicals for every growing season in order to produce anything from those soils. And this is, we're talking about conventional farms, right? Organic farms may or may not be run this way today, unfortunately. But small scale sustainable organic farming is very different from this. And if you, you seek out a small scale sustainable organic farm, generally they're doing things like composting, putting nutrients into the soil rather than fertilizers. They can't use chemical fertilizers if it's organic, or chemical pesticides that have been linked to cancers in people's bodies. But the use of chemicals does allow us to feed all of the people on the earth, right? More people, even though organic farms with certain types of processes can also feed and increase the nutrition of many, many people as well. Many farms are now today called CAFOs, or confined animal feeding operations. And CAFOs produce food animals. So for instance, chickens and cattle. If you've ever driven on the 5 to San Francisco from San Diego, you have smelled the CAFOs even before you've seen them, right? Thousands and thousands of cows on the side of the road, sort of standing in their own manure all day. Not a pretty sight. So these confined animal feeding operations can't really be called farms, but they are managed by people who generally are unskilled labor, with a couple of managers who oversee that labor, and they produce the farm they produce food animals on those farms for grocery stores and other consumption. They will generally be feeding animals antibiotics with every meal. They aren't allowed to feed hormones to chickens, for instance, because the hormones were getting into the chicken. Young girls were eating the chicken. They were developing breasts at 7, 8 years old. So that is now outlawed. But there are a lot of chemicals that are given to our food animals on non-organic or conventional farms to prevent them from getting sick, because they're in basically unhygienic conditions, and they're not being fed the types of things that their bodies were designed to eat, right? They're supposed to eat grass. Cows are ruminants. They have an extra stomach, but they're not fed grass because grass is short and it's very expensive to produce grass, right? To find an area where you can allow cows to eat the grass that they need to be healthy. So we generally feed cows corn because that's easy to produce and a lot less expensive, but cows aren't supposed to eat corn. So their stomachs get very acidic, they get sick, et cetera, et cetera. So we give them basically chemicals, to give them drugs so that they don't get sick, even though we're still feeding them the food that makes them sick. So, go figure. There's a lot of research out there on that if you're interested to know more. So we talked about some of the alternatives, and if you're interested in having options, and you have the resources to afford it, because that's the other issue, that only people with resources to afford sustainable, boutique farm animals, or organic meats, things like that, are going to be the ones who can access them, creating an even bigger divide in our society of, classes, because people who have money can access better food, can be healthier, have fewer problems, can access the medical system more easily, aren't penalized when they have to take a day off of work to go to the doctor. I mean, it's just all very, very integrated, with the ways that we get our food. And so when I think about culture and society, I think about how food production, the distribution of food, right, how people get their food, and the consumption of food, who consumes what, why, how, as right at the heart of the social organization of any group. How has globalization changed the way that we eat? So of course our food system today is all linked to this very global movement of food and people, etc. So to define globalization, it's basically the integration of all kinds of things together, right? That our political policies, our economic policies, the people producing things in different areas of the world, all of these are really connected, interconnected, which means that we can, get a food that does not grow in our area at our local grocery store. That people who live in snowy climates can get tomatoes all year whenever they want it at the grocery store. It also means that people with access can have a wide range of foods. People with less access generally have more access to processed foods, but not as many fresh foods during the year. And in fact, the people producing food generally have the least access to it. So if we think about where our food comes from, most of our apples actually come from China. You'd think they'd come from Washington or Oregon, but in fact, they come from China. The people who work on Chinese apple farms are not, often allowed to eat the produce, because that's what's bringing in income for the landowner, right? So there are, sort of class concerns and, national concerns that come up with food production in terms of globalization. Also environmental concerns, massive farms with lots of chemicals, lots of pesticides, the people who are producing our food being doused with these chemicals from the air or touching them, being around them all the time, not getting the protections that they need in order to feed us. And also this idea called the nutrition transition, which is something that happens in the process of modernization, in which people who used to be agriculturalists, let's say, native peoples of California, such as the Kumeyaay, who live in the area that we now call San Diego, and also Tijuana. So the Kumeyaay used to be a group of people who farmed for themselves. They had food sovereignty, they grew what they wanted, they ate what they wanted, it kept their blood pressure low, etc. And then when Europeans began to change that over the course of hundreds of years, you see this group going through what's called a nutrition transition. When they have less food sovereignty or autonomy or control over the food that they eat, and they start to eat more what's given to them or what is available, which is often processed and often not as healthy as the foods that natively grow in that area. Native peoples in this country have the highest rates of diabetes type 2 than anybody in the world, and this is partially due to that transition of going from these sort of low glycemic foods like fruit that comes off of cactus to then eating white bread and white flour and white rice, along with all the other processed and sweet foods that we find in supermarkets that come into these areas when people lose their food sovereignty. So if you look all over the world, you can see this nutrition transition happening, in which people who formerly were farming their own lands, they their health suffers as a people, as a group, as a community, when other people come in and take over that land and begin to farm it for a profit.